The very first argument against the New Testament as eyewitness testimony, argument number one is this: we know that the New Testament was written anonymously. We don't have any of the authors. They think we don't know who the New Testament writers were, therefore they could not have been written by eyewitnesses. And the presupposition is they were just invented. Whole cloth, just out of nothing. They say, well, you can't use that. That's definitely not eyewitness testimony because we don't have the name. It's a non sequitur. In other words, so what? It doesn't follow that if we didn't know the authors, they would necessarily be not eyewitnesses. Hi, welcome to Church for Skeptics. We're going to talk about that great Greek scholar. His name is Anonymous. We're going to talk about the anonymity of the New Testament. And I hope you'll stick with me about this. And I've got a lot of notes, so if I look up and down, forgive me for that, please. Most of what we've been talking about is the New Testament as history. We've been doing a lot of videos about that. And in particular, then, the history of the New Testament as being eyewitness testimony. And needless to say, I've gotten a lot of comments to the contrary, because the consensus view in some sense is that the New Testament was not written by anybody that knew Jesus. So obviously no eyewitness testimony there. In response to that, I'm actually engaging with the comments and considering the comments. Some of them are fairly nice. I mean, they're contrary to what I believe, but you know, they're not angry and hostile. There are a few, of course, you're going to get that. But I want to engage with them. So in that process, I've been reading a lot of their material, the scholarly skeptics there, of course, starting with BART ERHMAN. We've used him a lot. And also just to watch some of the skeptical work on YouTube about this. And I've come up with almost from across the board, every single time, the very first argument against the New Testament as eyewitness testimony, argument number one is this: we know that the New Testament was written anonymously. We don't have any of the authors of the New Testament. Now, we're going to deal with that, of course. So the presupposition for that is, of course, obviously, we think we know what the authors are: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John for the Gospels. And that's primarily where the contention is, that Paul would be recognized in most of his epistles. We'd credit him with that, even the skeptics would. But for the Gospels and maybe Acts, since it's also a composition of Luke, we think, they don't think that. And so I've done a lot of research about that. Every time the first argument is, it's anonymous. The New Testament, or at least the Gospels, are anonymous. They're not written by, and therefore, now think about this, and this is going to be my first argument here. They think we don't know who the New Testament writers were, therefore they could not have been written by eyewitnesses. Now there are other arguments, but we're going to focus on that particular one. So the presupposition is, well, why do we know Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? And the presupposition is they were just invented. Whole cloth, just out of nothing. And so the early church fathers, and we actually don't have, with the earliest manuscripts, which would be, you don't have that many early ones, not in the first century anyway. You got a couple of little fragments. The earliest fragments, 125. Think about this. The earliest fragment we have of any New Testament is a little bit called the Rylands fragment. It's just a credit card size from the Gospel of John. And it's written, that copy was probably written 100 to 125 AD. Now, and BART ERHMAN would agree with this, the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John start showing up by 200 AD, a generation later. So did they make it up out of whole cloth? Why did they pick those names? We're going to talk about those things. I think it's actually silly. But the first thing I want to say is it's a non sequitur. And I'll give you two questions, and then I'm going to give you the reasons that I'm convinced that the New Testament really is the eyewitness testimony. And beyond that, of course, in further episodes here. But my first point is it's a non sequitur. In other words, so what? It doesn't follow that if we didn't know the authors, they would necessarily be not eyewitnesses. What if somebody is at the Battle of Gettysburg, the soldier, let's say, and the day after the battle, he wrote a letter to his wife and didn't sign his name, and we had an anonymous letter from the Battle of Gettysburg that was written obviously at the time of the event, at the place of the event. He was a practitioner in the event. It's obvious they didn't sign his name. Would they say, well, you can't use that? That's definitely not eyewitness testimony because we don't have the name. You see what I'm saying? It's a non sequitur. It doesn't necessarily follow. Now, I think we do have the names, which adds to the fuel to the fire here, I guess. The second thing I want to ask is this: if the New Testament was doing well enough to spread Christianity throughout the Roman Empire by 100 AD. Doesn't mean they were all Christians, of course, but it had spread throughout the Roman Empire. And that's why we get so many fragments. That's why we get so much testimony from around the empire. And by the way, we have the testimony of who wrote the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and that comes from all over the place. My point is, why would they add superfluous names? What's the point of that? Well, the point of that, I guess, would be that they want to show apostolic authority to the documents, the Gospels, because that was the standard of the early church. If it's not written or endorsed if it's not the testimony of an apostle, it's not Scripture. And we're going to do a whole series, not a series, but a whole episode about that down the road. But that's my two questions here. It just seems like it doesn't follow. It's a non sequitur. Now, let me give you reasons that I think the New Testament is eyewitness testimony. As BART ERHMAN would say, the authors' names start showing up around late in the 2nd century. So I'll give you a couple of examples here. There's a document called the Moratorian Canon. It's a fragment, and but it lists and this is 175 AD. So it's still, it's 120 years or so, 150 years almost, somewhere around there, from the Gospels themselves or from the events of the Gospels themselves. But all the names are there. So as BART ERHMAN says, that's when the names start showing up in probably more late 2nd century. You also have the testimony about that same time of some of what we would call early church fathers. Now, the early church fathers are, generally speaking, the disciples of the apostles, the 2nd and 3rd generation of Christian leaders. Irenaeus might be better put, wrote somewhere around 150. He died in 200 AD. He was from Smyrna, but he ended up being the bishop of the church in Lyons, what we now call France. And he was adamant that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote the 4 Gospels. Here's my point. Why would he make that up? Especially, and we'll talk about this, especially Mark and Luke. He might make up Matthew. I don't think he would make up Matthew. Maybe the only one would be John if he wanted to make up an apostle that gave them authority, or God that gave the documents. But why would he do that? He's already got all the Gospels. If they weren't, and I'll go on. Let me just keep going here. My point is this. The other guy, there's another church father. His name is Papius. He is the bishop of Hierapolis, which is now in Turkey, and sort of on a trade route. So he was in a good position to get a lot of information. And he quotes, as written by the authors, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, a lot of Paul's. He had a New Testament. And he's writing in about 100 AD, maybe a little after that. Think about it. He's writing 100, 120. He has the documents. And why wouldn't he have them? I mean, it's only been so long since they've been written themselves. And he quotes them all. Why would he want to make that up? And how is it that he has the same information as Irenaeus in Lyon, France? And you can go on and on. You have the Gospels by name, by 200 or so AD, coming from all over the Roman Empire. And we have some of the manuscripts and some of the writing. We have a lot of the writings from the early church fathers who quote the New Testament so much that you could reproduce it even if you didn't have the manuscripts. You could still reproduce the New Testament documents from their writings. I think that's pretty important. Here's my point. BART ERHMAN rightly says we don't have the originals. We don't have the original Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Acts, and everything else. We don't have the first copies, even, of the originals. We don't even have the copies of the copies of the copies of the copies, and we don't know how many generations before we actually start getting manuscripts. But they did. You know, the Declaration of Independence, and this is a loose analogy here, but the Declaration of Independence was written, I hope you know when, 1776. And it was written, it was scripted. It wasn't used on the printing press. And it's still preserved. Now, they do a lot better job. They have the white gloves thing. They probably didn't have that in the first century. But don't you like it when you see a documentary and somebody's handling these ancient documents with white gloves? I think that's kind of neat. My point is this, though. We still have, after 300 years virtually, we still have the Declaration of Independence because we've protected it. If they thought that they were writing Scripture, they would have, and they did, by the way, we know that from testimony, they were preserving as best they could the documents that they had, whether they were originals. They didn't write the originals and make a copy and then throw the originals away. How long would they have lasted? 100 years? If they were protected well, and no doubt, think about the Jewish culture and how much they protected their scrolls. These early Christians would have done the same thing. So let's say we have a document that's written in 200 AD. We have, by the way, something called the Bodmer. I hope I'm saying that right. Bodmer Papyrus. They call it P66 because it's the 66th manuscript written on papyrus. And Bodmer is the guy who owns it, a guy named Martin. It's in Geneva, Switzerland, by the way, if you want to go see it. And it's one of the earliest, almost full copies of the Gospel of John. Now, if that was written in 200, what did he get it from? What were they using as an earlier copy? Obviously not the originals, but let's say a copy of the copy, surely. If they last 100 years or 150 years, then something written 50 years earlier could have been the copy written at 200 AD, and we have that one. So it's not like you have these long distances between the original and the copies that we have. Now, when they start showing up with the names, why is it that they all of a sudden start showing up with the names? Well, think about this. And this is my next point here. Virtually, there are no ancient writers outside the Bible that signed their names. They just didn't do that. And technically, all ancient documents, virtually all of them, were anonymous in that sense. And yet we know most of the authors from that. Let me give you a couple of examples. Polybius was a great biographer. He wrote from about 200 BC, maybe 300 BC, to it was about 250 BC to the fall of Carthage. I knew that, and that's 146 BC. So he wrote these great biographies about that. Didn't sign his name a whit. Are they anonymous? Well, technically they are, but nobody doubts that. And you know, when we have the earliest copy of the writings of Polybius that we have were written about 900 AD. That's 1100 years later. And of course, they had some earlier copies, and the ones that they had earlier copies that we don't have them, but they did. That's my point with the Bible. And that's why we know he wrote, the guy that wrote him was Polybius. Listen, the same thing is true with Josephus. That's about 1100, with the writings that Josephus wrote, the great Jewish historian. As a matter of fact, Wikipedia says Josephus is the best source for first century history in Palestine next to the New Testament. Kind of just saying. Xenophon, Tacitus, even Caesar's, when he wrote Caesar's The Wars, didn't sign his name. But we know who wrote them because we have so many copies. Now, again, the New Testament is in a class by itself with the earlier copies. But the point is, there's no need to make the names up. And if they're coming from all over the empire, this is so important here. They're coming from all over the empire. Why in the world? They couldn't possibly look. If some church father, let's say in Smyrna, which would be Turkey, or in Hierapolis, or in Syria, or in Rome, from Rome, we have the testimony of Clement from Rome. They all use the same names. If they're making them up, especially Matthew, and especially Mark, and especially Luke, you think they're all going to make up the same names? Obviously not. They knew who wrote the Bible. They knew who wrote. It was obvious that they did. And here's the other thing. All of these original writers, the authors, even though they didn't internally put their name, usually what happened is this. They had a title page, just like we do, have a title page with the author's name, or maybe an epilogue, a back page with their name on it. And the reason they did that is to try to protect the documents, because those are the documents that are the parts of the documents that erode most quickly, the ones on the outside, the ones that get the air. And so that's why we've lost the names of the earliest ones. So when we get enough documents that the titles pages are there, then we start getting the author's names. That's the point here. How could the same, and I'll say this again, how could the same author's names come from different parts of the world and yet have the same name? Especially when you consider this. The only gospel name that really has any apostolic credibility, and I'll show you why I say this, is John. If they wanted to make up just out of whole cloth, let's attach a name to this gospel so everybody will believe it was from an apostle, they would have used John. They would have not used Matthew. Here's why. Matthew, the book of Matthew, whoever wrote it, definitely was written, I think everybody would agree with this, written by a Hebrew Christian, a Jewish Christian, to Jewish people to try to convince them that Jesus is the Messiah of Israel, the coming one, the promised Messiah. And there's so many references to the Old Testament in Matthew. Matthew was a tax collector, number one. Now think about this. Matthew was a tax collector, the most hated man in Israel. Here's another problem. If Matthew wrote this after 70 AD, I don't think it would have flown at all. We're going to make another video about that. But think about this. Matthew has friendly Roman soldiers in it. As a matter of fact, in Matthew chapter 8, Jesus says that there's a Roman soldiers who wants Jesus to come and heal his servant. And he does, but he doesn't have to go to the house because he believes in authority like he's, a Roman soldier. And Jesus said, I've not encountered such a great faith in all of Israel. So now in Matthew, we have a Roman soldier who has more faith than all the Jewish people Matthew's trying to reach. After 70 AD, when Rome destroyed Jerusalem and the temple and the Jewish people scattered, Matthew would not have written a document being friendly to Romans. I can almost guarantee that. I can't prove it, but I surely don't believe it. Then what about Luke? Luke is a Gentile. You're going to make up a name to attach apostolic. Yes, he was a companion of Paul, but you don't make up a name like that. Why not just put the Gospel of Paul if you want to make it from Paul? There's just no reason for that unless that's exactly what happened. It's just it seems like to me, as a believer, of course, that I just take the most reasonable, simplest explanation for these things. What about Mark? Mark is not an apostle. Why make up his name and attach that name to a gospel? There's just no reason for that. Mark shows up a lot of times in the Bible, and I'll kind of close with this idea here. Acts chapter 12, verse 12. This is the context here. Is Peter's in jail, and he miraculously gets out of jail, and he's thinking, okay, where do I go now? And he goes to the house where the disciples have been meeting. It's and I'll pick it up in Acts chapter 12, verse 12. When this had dawned on him, Peter's awareness that he had been delivered, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, also called Mark, where many people had gathered and were praying. It goes on, Peter knocks on the door and they don't know who it is. But my point is here, you got John Mark, his mother is named Mary, like a lot of mothers were in those days. And so Mark shows up. This is the same Mark. We're made aware that he is the cousin of Barnabas. And I'll turn you so they take him on a missionary journey, Barnabas and Mark and Paul, and they have a falling out. And so they want to go on the next journey, and Barnabas, who's Mark's cousin, wants to take him. Paul says no. And so let's look at, just since we're so close, Acts chapter 15 here, and it's verse 37. Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them, but Paul did not think it wise to take him, because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work. They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and left, commended by the believers to the grace of the Lord. So Mark's in here. He would have known Jesus at his house. He certainly knew Peter so well that Peter, and we'll give you one more verse here. Peter, in chapter 5, verse 13 says this. This is his I'll start in verse 12 for the final greetings. With the help of Silas, Peter says, whom I regard as a faithful brother. He's giving the final greetings. And that's what they did a lot in their letters. They would kind of sign them at the end and give the greetings rather than at the beginning. With the help of Silas, whom I regard as a faithful brother, I have written to you briefly, encouraging you and testifying that this is the true grace of God. Stand fast in it. Now, verse 13. She who is in Babylon, which is code word for Rome, she who is in Babylon, chosen together with you, sends you her greetings. And that's where Peter was. That's where he died, in Rome. Now watch this. And so does my son, Mark. The same church fathers that are writing around the late second century, about the same time that we're getting biblical documents, gospel manuscripts that attach in the title page or at the end the names of the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. About the same time, you're getting letters from church fathers from around the world that have the same names, and they attribute Mark as Peter's secretary. Well, it seems obvious here that they're close. Peter went to Mark's house when he got out of jail. He calls Mark his son, and he says that Mark is with him in Rome. What's the problem? I kind of finished this here, the bottom line. First of all, it says, do you think that we, in our great wisdom today, in 2024, have better data about the gospel writers and who wrote the gospels than they did in the 2nd century and 1st century when it was so close to the time of their writing? I don't think so. I think that the reason these names show up is because those are the authors. How can that be hard? And there's no good reason for the names except that they're the ones who wrote them. A Mark, a Luke, a Jewish tax collector? I don't think so. It's usually just reasonable to take things at face value unless you know otherwise. And no doubt they've made a lot of efforts to make it otherwise, but I don't think so. And I hope you don't either. We'll keep this up. We have some more things to talk about the reliability of the New Testament, its historicity, and its eyewitness testimony. Thanks for watching.